Imagine trusting someone completely. Now imagine them pushing your wheelchair off an 80-foot cliff while you're 7 months pregnant. Grace Hartford didn't have to imagine she lived it. Murdered by her husband's mistress, left for dead in the Atlantic Ocean, erased from existence. But Grace did something they never expected. She survived, and she spent 8 months plotting the perfect revenge. If you love stories about justice and unbreakable women, smash that like button now. Subscribe and drop a comment telling me, would you fight back or disappear forever? Let's begin. The security camera timestamp read 11:47 p.m. when Grace Hartford's wheelchair rolled toward the cliff edge. She didn't know the footage existed. She didn't know her best friend Caroline had disabled the main cameras, but missed the backup system. She only knew that the rain tasted like salt and fear, and that Vanessa Caldwell's Louboutin heels clicked behind her like a countdown. "Where's Preston?" Grace asked, her hand instinctively moving to her 7-month belly. The baby kicked, sensing her mother's racing heart. Vanessa stepped into view, golden hair untouched by the downpour, wearing a smile that belonged in nightmares. "Oh, sweetheart, he sent me. He doesn't have the stomach for this part." Grace's world tilted before the wheelchair did. Everything she'd ignored suddenly made terrible sense. The brake failure 6 months ago that left her paralyzed. Preston's increasingly cold stares. Caroline's convenient distance. The diamond earring she'd found in Preston's Mercedes that he claimed belonged to a client. "For what?" Grace whispered, though somewhere deep down she already knew. Vanessa crouched, bringing her face level with Grace's. Her breath smelled like expensive wine and casual cruelty. "For saying goodbye. You see, Preston and I have plans, big plans, and you're a liability now." The crippled wife with the sympathy vote. "You'd take everything in a divorce." "I'm pregnant, with his child. His mistake," Vanessa corrected. "One he's willing to pay to fix. Life insurance pays double for accidents. $15 million for a tragic suicide. Depressed pregnant woman in a wheelchair, overcome with grief about her condition. It practically writes itself." Grace tried to wheel backward. The mechanism jammed. Vanessa had planned everything. "Please," Grace begged, abandoning pride. "Please don't do this. I'll disappear. I'll sign anything. Just let me have my baby." For one heartbeat, Vanessa's expression softened. Then it hardened into something worse than hate. Indifference. "You were always so dramatic," Vanessa said, standing. Her hands gripped the wheelchair handles. "Goodbye, Grace Hartford." The shove came fast. The world became wind and rain, and the terrible silence before impact. Grace saw the rocks rushing up, the Atlantic Ocean hungry below. Her last conscious thought wasn't of Preston or betrayal. It was a prayer that her daughter might somehow survive. The wheelchair hit first, metal shrieking against stone. Then Grace's body followed. Physics and gravity doing their merciless work. Pain exploded everywhere and nowhere. Salt water filled her lungs. The current dragged her under, away from the rocks, out toward the open sea where bodies disappeared without questions. Above, Vanessa stood at the cliff edge, mascara running in the rain, watching until she saw no movement. Then she turned, pulled out her phone, and called Preston. "It's done," she said simply. On the other end, Preston Hartford poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon with shaking hands. Did she suffer? Does it matter now? He ended the call without answering. In his Hamptons estate office, surrounded by photos of the life he'd just murdered, Preston stared at his wedding portrait. Grace, radiant and whole, smiling at a man she'd believed in. He drained the bourbon and poured another, 60 miles north. The ocean carried Grace's broken body along the coast. She should have been dead. Every medical text said so. But somewhere between the fall and the sea, between the rocks and the mercy of cold water slowing her blood loss, Grace Hartford held on. Not for herself, for the flutter of life still fighting inside her. When dawn broke gray and cold over Maine's rocky shore, Dr. Owen Pierce was jogging his usual route. He'd lost his medical license 3 years ago for exposing hospital corruption. Now he lived quietly, running a small off-grid clinic for people who fell through society's cracks. He noticed the debris first, then the blood on the rocks, then the impossible, a woman, tangled in kelp and driftwood. Lips blue but chest rising in shallow breaths. Owen ran faster than he had in years, Preston Hartford's grief was Oscar-worthy. He stood at Grace's memorial service in a black Tom Ford suit, surrounded by 300 guests who'd come to mourn a woman they'd barely known. The Hamptons elite didn't actually care about Grace. They came for the spectacle, the networking, the chance to be seen grieving publicly. Vanessa played her role perfectly. Black Chanel dress, understated jewelry, the loyal assistant comforting her devastated boss. Nobody questioned why her hand lingered too long on Preston's shoulder. Nobody wondered why she had the access codes to his penthouse, his car, his life. Carolyn Winters delivered the eulogy. Grace's supposed best friend spoke about depression, about how Grace had confided her darkest thoughts after the accident. She felt like a burden, Carolyn told the crowd, dabbing tears that might have been real. She said Preston deserved better than a wife who couldn't even walk. I should have seen the signs. We all should have. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. By the time Caroline finished, half the room believed Grace's death was inevitable. A tragedy, yes, but somehow understandable. The narrative was set broken woman, overwhelmed by disability and pregnancy, chose the sea over suffering. The police investigation lasted 48 hours. Detective Hank Morrison, a 20-year veteran with a mortgage bigger than his conscience, filed the report without asking difficult questions. Preston's $100,000 consulting fee guaranteed that. The case closed as accidental death with suicidal ideation. Clean, simple, profitable. Meanwhile, in coastal Maine, Grace Hartford was dying by inches. Owen Pierce worked 72 hours straight. His clinic wasn't equipped for trauma this severe. Grace had 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, internal bleeding, compound fractures in her left arm, and a skull fracture that should have killed her instantly. But the baby's heartbeat kept fighting. You can't save them both, Owen told himself on hour 60, exhausted and desperate. Grace remained unconscious, her body trying to protect the pregnancy while simultaneously shutting down from catastrophic injuries. He made the choice surgeons pray they'll never face. At hour 71, with Grace's blood pressure crashing and the baby in distress, Owen performed an emergency cesarean section on his clinic table. His hands shook. He hadn't done surgery in 3 years. But the alternative was watching them both die. The baby girl emerged silent and blue. Owen's heart stopped. Then she coughed and cried and filled the small clinic with the sound of defiant life. Ruby May, he whispered, the name appearing in his mind unbidden. You're a fighter like your mother. Grace woke 14 days later to fluorescent lights and the distant sound of an infant crying. Her body felt like it had been disassembled and rebuilt wrong. Everything hurt, but the pain meant she was alive. My baby, she croaked, throat raw. Owen appeared beside her bed, exhausted and unshaven. She's alive. 3 pounds, 2 ounces, fighting like hell, just like you. Grace closed her eyes as tears leaked sideways into her hair. How long? 2 weeks. You've been in a coma. Grace, I need to tell you something. I had to deliver her early. You were dying. Is she okay? She's perfect. But there's a problem. I'm not legally licensed. I kept your admission off the books. Nobody knows you survived. Grace's laugh was bitter and broken. Good. They think I'm dead. Your memorial service was last Tuesday. It's on YouTube. 10,000 views. Show me. Owen hesitated, then pulled up the video on his tablet. Grace watched her own funeral with the detachment of someone observing a stranger's life. There was Preston, playing the devastated widower. There was Vanessa, playing the supportive friend. And there was Caroline, selling the lie so beautifully that Grace almost believed it herself. When Caroline said, she felt like a burden, Grace's hands clenched into fists. That bitch was in on it, she whispered. That's why she stopped visiting. She knew. Owen looked uncomfortable. Grace, you need to rest. We can figure out. They tried to kill me. They took my life, my identity, everything. And now they have the world convinced I killed myself because I was weak. You're not weak. You survived a 70-foot fall into the Atlantic Ocean. Grace met his eyes. Then let's make sure I survived for a reason. That night, while Ruby May slept in a donated incubator and Owen researched how to care for a premature infant, Grace made herself watch the entire memorial service. She memorized every lie, every false tear, every carefully crafted detail of the narrative they'd built on her grave. When Preston spoke about their love, about how Grace had been his everything, rage burned through her like medicine. "I'm going to destroy you," she promised the screen. "All of you." But first she had to heal. And then she had to become someone else entirely. 3 weeks after her resurrection, Grace Hartford learned she was a ghost in more ways than one. Her credit cards were frozen, her bank accounts closed, her design firm dissolved, assets transferred to Preston as her widower and executor of her estate. Legally, Grace Hartford no longer existed. "You need a new identity," Owen said, reviewing the paperwork that proved her erasure. "Birth certificate, social security number, everything. I know people who can help, but it's expensive." "I don't have anything," Grace said, holding Ruby against her chest. The baby was gaining weight, growing stronger. Grace's own recovery was slower. Her ribs screamed with every breath. Her left arm was pinned and useless. But she could walk now, shakily, using a cane. Owen looked uncomfortable. "I have money, offshore accounts from before everything fell apart. I can front you 50,000 for documents and a place to stay. But Grace, you need to understand something. If Preston discovers you're alive, he'll finish what Vanessa started. Let him try. I'm serious. These aren't amateurs. They killed you once. They'll do it again. And next time they'll make sure there's a body." Grace studied the man who'd saved her life. Owen Pierce was 40, maybe 42, with silver threading his dark hair and eyes that had seen too much. He'd lost his license for doing the right thing, exposing a hospital, covering up negligent deaths. Now he lived in exile, helping people society had abandoned. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Helping me. You could have turned me over to authorities, collected a reward, moved on." Owen was quiet for a long moment. 10 years ago, my sister ran from an abusive husband. He found her 3 days later and killed her in a parking lot while people watched and did nothing. Everyone said they didn't want to get involved. I swore I'd never be that person." Grace reached out with her good hand and squeezed his. "I'm sorry, boy. Don't be sorry, though. Get even." Over the next 2 months, Grace transformed. Owen's contacts provided bulletproof documents. Grace Hartford died in the Atlantic. Emma Ashford was born in Seattle, an interior designer relocating east for fresh opportunities. The resemblance was there if you look it closely, but grief and trauma had carved 30 pounds off Grace's frame. Her hair, once chestnut brown, was now platinum blonde. Colored contacts changed her eyes from green to blue. When Grace looked in the mirror, a stranger stared back. Good. She spent 16 hours a day in physical therapy, rebuilding strength destroyed by the fall and months of atrophy. The pain was extraordinary. Sometimes she woke up screaming, phantom sensations of falling, of drowning, of Vanessa's hands on the wheelchair. Owen would find her on the floor, shaking, Ruby crying in the next room. "I can't do this," she sobbed one night, 3 months in. "I can't be strong enough to fight them." Owen pulled her up, forcing her to stand on trembling legs. "You survived a murder attempt in a 70-foot fall. You delivered a baby while in a coma. You're already stronger than they'll ever be. Now prove it." The next day, Grace walked a mile without the cane. The day after, 2 miles. By month 4, she was jogging. By month 6, she could do 100 push-ups and hold a plank for 5 minutes. Her body became a weapon she sharpened with obsessive focus. But physical strength wasn't enough. She needed information, leverage, a way inside Preston's world. That's when Owen introduced her to his hacker friend, a woman named Alex who lived in an RV and made 6 figures breaking into corporate servers. "Your husband's company is a front," Alex explained, showing Grace financial records that painted Preston's empire as one massive money laundering operation. "Reynolds Development Group sounds legitimate, but 70% of their properties are shell corporations. He's washing money for some very bad people. Can you prove it? I can get you everything. Bank transfers, shell company registrations, communications with offshore accounts. But Grace, if you expose this, you're not just fighting Preston and Vanessa. You're fighting organized crime. These people kill witnesses." Grace bounced Ruby on her knee, looking at her daughter's innocent face. "They already tried to kill me. I'm just returning the favor." By month 8, Emma Ashford had a portfolio, references, and a design aesthetic that had gotten attention from several New York firms. Grace had practiced her new identity so thoroughly that sometimes she forgot she was pretending. The Seattle accent came naturally now. The backstory about her fictional husband who died in a car accident felt real. When she saw the job posting for a senior interior designer at Reynolds Development Group, Grace's heart rate didn't even spike. She was ready. She submitted her application on a Tuesday. Preston's assistant called on Thursday. "Mr. Hartford would like to meet you Friday at 2, the assistant said. Not Vanessa. Preston had a new assistant now, some fresh graduate who didn't know she was working for a murderer. "I'll be there," Emma Ashford said smoothly. Owen drove her to the interview, parking 3 blocks from Reynolds headquarters. "You don't have to do this," he said. "We can go to the FBI with what we have. Let them handle it. The FBI won't care about a dead woman's conspiracy theories. I need proof. Real, undeniable. Destroy his life proof, and I can only get that from inside." She kissed Ruby's forehead. The baby was staying with Owen's neighbor, a retired nurse who asked no questions and stepped out of the car. Walking into Reynolds Development Group felt like entering enemy territory. The lobby screamed money Italian marble, contemporary art, a receptionist who looked like she'd stepped off a runway. Grace's hands didn't shake. Her smile didn't falter. Emma Ashford belonged here. Preston's office was on the 42nd floor, corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. When his assistant showed Grace in, Preston was on the phone, barking orders about a property acquisition. He waved her to a chair without looking up. Grace sat and studied the man she'd once loved. Preston had aged. Gray touched his temples now. Lines creased his forehead. He looked successful, powerful, and utterly hollow. When he finally ended the call and looked at her, Grace held her breath. This was the moment. Would he see through the disguise? Would her voice, her mannerisms, some ineffable essence give her away? Preston's gaze swept over her with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating a tool. Emma Ashford, Seattle, impressive portfolio. Why New York? Fresh start, Grace said, voice steady. My husband died 2 years ago. Too many memories in Seattle. Something flickered in Preston's expression. Sympathy, guilt. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. I'm ready to focus on work now. Your company's projects are exactly what I'm looking for. Ambitious, uncompromising, willing to take risks. Preston smiled. Most people are intimidated by our scope. I'm not most people. The interview lasted 30 minutes. Grace demonstrated expertise, creativity, and exactly the right amount of deference. Preston hired her on the spot. Starting Monday, $85,000 salary plus bonuses. When she left his office, Grace made it to the elevator before her composure cracked. Her hand shook so violently she could barely press the button. She just looked into the eyes of the man who ordered her death and felt nothing from him. No recognition, no remorse, nothing. In the lobby bathroom, she locked herself in a stall and threw up. Then she cleaned herself up, reapplied lipstick, and called Owen. I'm in, she said. Grace. Emma, she corrected. Grace Hartford is dead. Emma Ashford is going to destroy them all. Emma Ashford's first day at Reynolds Development Group began with Vanessa Caldwell's hand extended in greeting. Grace stared at it for 3 seconds too long, fighting the urge to break every finger. Then she smiled and shook it. Emma, welcome. I'm Vanessa, VP of Operations. Preston speaks very highly of you. Vanessa's grip was firm, her smile practiced. She wore a ring that Grace recognized in emeralds surrounded by diamonds. Preston had given it to Grace on their 3rd anniversary. Seeing it on Vanessa's hand felt like swallowing glass. Thank you. I'm excited to contribute to the team. Vanessa's office was 2 doors from Preston's, connected by a private hallway that probably saw more use after hours than during business. Grace's workspace was in the design department. Open floor plan, surrounded by eager young architects who didn't know they were working for criminals. The first week, Grace kept her head down. She learned the office dynamics, the project timelines, who reported to whom. She planted 3 recording devices in conference rooms and 1 in Vanessa's office. Disguised as decorative items she'd brought from home to personalize the space. Nobody questioned it. New employees always tried to make their mark. Week 2, she attended her first executive meeting. Preston presided at the head of a glass table, Vanessa to his right, looking every inch the power couple. Grace sat 5 seats down, taking notes on a new luxury development in Brooklyn. The property acquisition closes Friday, Preston said. Timeline for demolition is aggressive. We need permits pushed through by end of month. His lead architect frowned. That building has historical designation. Demo permits could take 6 months minimum. Vanessa smiled. Leave that to me. I have contacts at city planning. After the meeting, Grace lingered, pretending to review notes. She watched Vanessa and Preston through the glass wall of his office. They stood close, too close for colleagues. Vanessa's hand touched his chest. Preston leaned in, then they kissed, and Grace's entire body went rigid. She'd known, intellectually, about the affair, but seeing it was different. The casual intimacy, the ownership in Vanessa's touch, the way Preston pulled her closer, it was everything he'd stopped giving Grace months before the fall. Her colleague Sarah noticed her staring. Yeah, it's not exactly subtle. They've been together since his wife died. Tragic story. Actually, she was pregnant, fell off a cliff, depression. They said. Grace's smile felt like it might crack her face. How awful. Right, but I guess life goes on. Vanessa's good for business. She gets things done. That night, Grace listened to the recordings from Vanessa's office. Most of it was mundane permit discussions, contractor negotiations, budget reviews. Then, at timestamp 4:37 p.m., Gold Preston's voice. The Brooklyn property owner is refusing to sell. Stubborn old man. Vanessa, want me to handle it? Preston, same as the Atlantic City situation. Vanessa's laugh. Fire works wonders for changing minds. Preston, just make it clean. Last thing we need is another investigation. Grace played it 3 times, hands shaking. They were discussing arson, potential murder, and they talked about it like ordering lunch. She sent the recording to Alex, the hacker. Can you trace this Atlantic City situation? Alex responded 4 hours later. Found it. Property fire 18 months ago. Owner died, cause listed as electrical malfunction, but fire marshal had suspicions. Investigation dropped after owner's family accepted settlement from Reynolds Development. $2 million for silence. Grace felt sick. How many others? Still digging. But Grace, if they've done this before, they have a system. People who handle problems, you need to be careful. Too late for careful. Grace was inside the machine now, learning how it worked. Preston's empire wasn't built on good real estate deals. It was built on intimidation, bribery, and selective violence. And everyone around him either participated or looked away. Week 3, Grace was invited to Preston's penthouse for a team dinner. Casual, Vanessa said, just the executive staff, celebrating the Brooklyn deal closing. Grace accepted with appropriate enthusiasm while internally screaming. The penthouse was obscene, floor-to-ceiling windows, original artwork, furniture that cost more than most people's cars. Grace had helped design this space, back when she was Preston's wife. She'd chosen the marble countertops, the lighting fixtures, the color palette. Now she stood in it as a stranger, drinking wine and making small talk with people who'd attended her funeral. Carolyn Winters was there. Grace's former best friend had moved up in the world, now working as Preston's PR consultant. She was telling a story about managing media for some celebrity divorce when her eyes met Grace's across the room. For one terrible second, recognition flickered. Caroline's smile faltered. Her gaze sharpened, studying Grace's face with sudden intensity. Then Vanessa called for everyone's attention, proposing a toast, and the moment passed. But when Grace glanced back, Caroline was still watching her, expression unreadable. At midnight, Grace excused herself to use the bathroom. Instead, she slipped into Preston's home office. She had maybe 90 seconds before someone noticed her absence. Her hands flew over his computer keyboard, password protected. But Alex had given her a bypass key. Files opened. Grace plugged in a thumb drive and started copying everything. Financial records, emails, property documents, evidence of a dozen illegal deals, bribes paid to city officials, shell companies in the Cayman Islands. The drive was 70% full when she heard footsteps. Grace yanked the drive free, closed windows, and was standing by the bookshelf pretending to examine Preston's first edition collection when he walked in. "Emma, you okay?" She turned with a smile. "Sorry, just admiring your library." "I'm a sucker for rare books." Preston relaxed. "First editions are a weakness of mine. That one's a signed Hemingway." They talked about literature for 5 minutes. Grace's heart hammering the entire time. The thumb drive in her pocket felt like it weighed 10 pounds. If he searched her, if he suspected, she was dead. But Preston just smiled and guided her back to the party with a hand on her lower back. The same hand that had once held her while she cried after the accident. The same hand that had signed off on her murder. When Grace finally left at 2 a.m., she made it to Owen's car before vomiting into the gutter. He rubbed her back while she shook. "I got it," she managed. "Everything. Enough to bury him. Then we go to the FBI, tonight. This is over." Grace shook her head. "Not yet. Caroline recognized me. I saw it in her eyes. She's going to tell them. Then we need to move you now. Get you and Ruby somewhere safe." "No." Grace's voice was steel. "I'm not running. Not this time. If they're coming for me, I want them to come. Because I'm ready." Owen looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Maybe she had. But Grace Hartford had died once. Mama Ashford had nothing left to lose. Carolyn Winters made the call at 3 a.m. When insomnia and bourbon finally overcame discretion, Vanessa answered on the second ring. Voice alert despite the hour. "The new designer," Carolyn said without preamble. "Emma Ashford, there's something wrong." "Wrong how?" Vanessa's tone sharpened. "I can't explain it. Just a feeling. The way she looks at Preston, the way she moves, Vanessa, I think she looks like Grace." Silence stretched. "Then Grace is dead. You delivered her eulogy." "I know. But what if that wasn't her in the water? What if she survived?" Vanessa's laugh was cold. "I watched her fall. Nobody survives that. People survive impossible things all the time. I'm telling you, something's off." Her eyes. "When I looked at her tonight for just a second, I swear I saw Grace." "Then we verify," Vanessa said simply. "If Emma Ashford is who she claims, her background will check out. If she's not, we'll know within 48 hours. And Caroline, if you're right, if Grace somehow survived and came back, we finish what we started. Permanently." The investigation began immediately. Vanessa hired a private investigator, former FBI, who specialized in background checks that went deeper than legal. By Wednesday, he had answers. "Emma Ashford exists," the investigator reported, sitting in Vanessa's office. "But barely. Birth certificate checks out, social security numbers legitimate, driver's license, credit history, but it's all surface level. No childhood photos on social media. No friends from Seattle who remember her. Her supposed husband's death certificate exists, but I can't find any marriage license. It's like she was manufactured 2 years ago." Vanessa's blood went cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Emma Ashford is a well-constructed identity, but it's not real. Whoever she is, she's hiding something. Whether that's Grace Hartford, I can't say, but she's definitely not who she claims." Vanessa paid the investigator double for his silence and spent the rest of the day reviewing security footage. There in the elevator, when Emma thought she was alone, she touched her ribs gingerly, like they still hurt. There in the conference room, she positioned herself to always face the door. Classic trauma response. And there, frozen on camera, the angle of her jaw, the shape of her eyes. Without the blonde hair and weight loss, she could be Grace. That night, Vanessa and Preston met at his penthouse. She poured them both drinks with hands that didn't shake and delivered the news. "Either our new designer is a corporate spy with a fake identity, or your dead wife isn't dead. Either way, we have a problem." Preston's face drained of color. "That's impossible. Did you see the body?" "The police found her wheelchair in pieces. DNA on the rocks matched her blood type. They stopped searching after 3 days. Blood type, Preston, not DNA match, not actual remains. Blood type, which matches millions of people." Vanessa set down her glass with deliberate care. "If Grace survived, if she's been planning this for months, we're not just facing exposure, we're facing murder charges." Preston stood and walked to the window. Manhattan glittering below. What do? We confirm it's her, then we eliminate the problem. But this time, we make absolutely certain she's dead. Meanwhile, Grace sat in Owen's clinic, reviewing the files she'd stolen. Each document was another nail in Preston's coffin. Bribery, money laundering, arson, and buried in the emails, a thread that made her blood freeze. Subject line, Atlantic City Solution, final payment. Preston to Vanessa. Confirming payment to Marcus for handling the Atlantic City situation. Fire worked as planned. Owner deceased. Family accepted settlement. Recommends same approach for Brooklyn if necessary. Vanessa's reply, Marcus delivered perfectly. We'll keep him on retainer for future problems. Grace's hands trembled. Marcus, a name, a specific person they used to kill people who got in their way. And they'd used him before, which meant there were other victims, other families who'd been silenced with money or fear. We need to find Marcus, Grace told Owen. If we can get him to testify, if Marcus is who I think he is, he's not testifying against anyone. Owen interrupted. He'd been researching while Grace read files. Marcus Donovan, former Special Forces, dishonorable discharge, suspected in multiple arsons across 3 states. He's a professional. If Preston and Vanessa hired him, it's because he's good at making problems disappear permanently. Then we go to the FBI now. Tonight, we have enough evidence to wow. Grace's phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then instinct made her pick up. Emma Ashford, a woman's voice. Professional, but with an edge. Yes, this is Detective Linda Shaw, NYPD. I need you to come to the precinct to answer some questions about your employment at Reynolds Development Group. Grace's pulse spiked. Questions about what? I'd rather discuss it in person. Can you come in tomorrow morning 9 a.m.? Am I being accused of something? Just some inconsistencies in your background check that we need to clarify. Nothing to worry about if everything's legitimate. The call ended. Grace sat frozen, the phone dead in her hand. That was a trap, Owen said. They're not cops. Or if they are, Preston owns them like he owned Morrison. I know. Grace's mind raced. Caroline told them, they know who I am, which means they're coming. Then we run. Right now, I have cash, fake passports, a place in Canada where no ipo. Grace stood, pacing. Running means they win. Running means leaving Ruby to grow up knowing her mother was killed and nobody did anything. I'm not running. Grace, these people kill witnesses. You can't fight them alone. I'm not alone. I have evidence. I have you. And I have something they don't, nothing left to lose. She pulled out her phone and called the one person she thought might help. Marlo Sinclair, investigative journalist for the New York Times. They'd met once, years ago, at a charity event. Grace remembered her as sharp, fearless, someone who'd built a career exposing corruption. Marlo answered on the 3rd ring. This better be good. It's 4 a.m. My name is Grace Hartford. I was murdered 8 months ago. And I have evidence that Preston Hartford and Vanessa Caldwell are running a criminal enterprise that's killed at least 3 people. Are you interested? Silence. Then where are you, Marlo? Sinclair arrived at Owen's clinic at dawn, carrying recording equipment and a skepticism that could cut glass. She was 40-something, gray streaking her dark hair, wearing jeans and a leather jacket that had seen better days. You're supposed to be dead, she said, studying Grace's face. I covered your memorial service. Sad story. Depressed cripple throws herself off a cliff. Grace flinched at the word, but held Marlo's gaze. That's the story they sold. Here's what actually happened. For 3 hours, Grace laid it out. The accident that wasn't an accident, the isolation, the affair, Vanessa's confession on the cliff, the fall, Owen's rescue, the fabricated suicide narrative, and finally, the evidence recordings, financial documents, emails discussing arson and murder. Marlo listened without interrupting, taking notes in shorthand. When Grace finished, the journalist sat back and exhaled slowly. If even half of this is true, it's the biggest story it'll ever break. But Grace, I need corroboration. The recordings are good, but they can claim they're discussing hypothetical scenarios. The financial crimes need forensic accounting. And your testimony alone won't stand up in court when they have police reports, witness statements, and a memorial service on record. What do you need? I need someone on the inside to go on record. Someone who participated in their crimes and is willing to testify. Without that, this is just an elaborate conspiracy theory from a woman who faked her death. Grace felt hope crumbling. Everyone who knows the truth is either dead or being paid to stay quiet. Then we make someone scared enough to talk. Marlowe's smile was sharp. I'm going to write this story, but I'm going to send them advance notice that it's coming. Sometimes, when people know they're about to be exposed, they panic, and panic makes people sloppy. Owen shook his head. You're painting a target on Grace's back. The target's already there, Marlowe countered. They know who she is by now. The only question is whether we expose them before they silence her again. That afternoon, Marlowe sent an email to Preston Hartford's office. Mr. Hartford, I'm writing a feature on Reynolds Development Group for the Times. I'd like to discuss allegations of financial improprieties, specifically regarding shell companies in the Cayman Islands and suspicious property acquisitions. Please contact me to arrange an interview. Publication date is pending, but imminent. Preston received the email at 2:15 p.m. By 2:30, his attorney Douglas Reed was on speakerphone, and Vanessa was in his office with the door locked. She knows, Preston said, voice hollow. Somehow, someone talked. Reed's voice crackled through the speaker. Don't panic. Journalists fish all the time. It doesn't mean she has anything concrete. What if she does? Vanessa paced, heels clicking on hardwood. What if Grace went to the press? Then we neutralize Grace before this gets published. Reed said calmly. I have contacts. People who handle situations like this discreetly. Preston's face went gray. You're talking about killing a journalist now, too. I'm talking about protecting your assets and freedom. Right now, you're facing potential RICO charges, multiple counts of fraud, possibly conspiracy to commit murder. That's life in prison. Preston, unless we contain this, Vanessa stopped pacing. Use Marcus. He's been reliable before. For burning buildings, Preston said. Not for solving problems. Vanessa interrupted. Grace is a problem. The journalist is a problem. We solve them. Tonight. Before this goes any further. Preston looked at the woman he'd chosen over his wife. 8 months ago, killing Grace had seemed abstract, necessary. But now, discussing more murders in his office while Manhattan hummed below, he saw clearly what he'd become. Not a businessman. A monster. I can't, he whispered. Vanessa's expression hardened. Then you'll go to prison, and I won't go with you. Reed, set it up. I'll handle Preston. After the lawyer hung up, Vanessa poured Preston a drink. You're having doubts. We killed my wife, my pregnant wife. You didn't kill anyone. I did. You just benefited from it. And you can keep benefiting, or you can grow a conscience and spend the rest of your life in a cell. Choose. Preston drank and chose, like he always had, the path of least resistance, the option that kept him comfortable and powerful. He told himself he had no choice. He told himself Grace had forced this by not staying dead. By 8 p.m., Marcus Donovan had his assignment. 2 targets. 1 journalist, 1 ghost. Make it look like an accident. Complete by midnight. Owen's clinic had no security system, which made it easy. Marcus approached from the beachside at 10:45 p.m., avoiding the road cameras. He'd done surveillance for 3 hours. 1 man inside Dr. Owen Pierce. 1 woman probably the target. No visible weapons. No dogs. No complications. He picked the lock in 30 seconds and entered through the rear door. The clinic was dark except for light from 1 room. Marcus moved like smoke, suppressing pistol in hand. He'd make it quick. Professionals didn't torture. They just eliminated and left. But when he entered the lit room, it was empty. Just a lamp on a timer, and a laptop playing recorded sounds of conversation. Behind him, Owen's voice, "Don't move." Marcus turned slowly. The doctor stood in the doorway, holding a shotgun with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. Drop the gun. Kick it away. Slowly. Marcus complied, assessing. 1 shooter, 12 gauge, close quarters. Not good odds. You're making a mistake, Doc. The mistake was you coming here. Grace, he's clear. From the shadows, Grace emerged, holding her phone. I've been recording since you picked the lock. Breaking and entering. Attempted murder. And you're going to tell me who hired you. Or I'm uploading this to every news outlet in New York. Marcus smiled. You think I care? You can't prove who sent me. No, Marlo Sinclair said, stepping out of the third doorway with her own recording equipment. But you just confirmed you were sent. That's enough for a warrant. And when the police search your communications, your bank records, your contacts, they'll connect you to Preston Hartford. You're done, huh? For the first time, Marcus looked uncertain. I want a lawyer. You'll get one, Owen said. Right after the police arrive, I called them 5 minutes ago. Sirens wailed in the distance. Marcus's professional composure cracked. You don't understand. These people, they'll kill me if I talk. They'll kill you if you don't, Grace corrected. But if you testify, protective custody, witness protection, a chance to live, what's it going to be? Marcus looked at the three of them, at the walls closing in, and made his calculation. I want immunity, full immunity for everything. And I'll give you Preston Hartford, Vanessa Caldwell, and 6 other clients, everything, names, dates, crimes, all of it. Grace's smile was cold and victorious. Start talking. The FBI raid on Reynolds Development Group happened at 6 a.m., simultaneous with raids on Preston's penthouse, Vanessa's apartment, and 3 shell company offices. 50 agents, coordinated across Manhattan, executing warrants based on Marcus Donovan's testimony and 8 months of accumulated evidence. Preston was arrested in his bathrobe, still half asleep when agents burst through his door. They read him his rights while he stood in his $1,000 slippers, watching his empire collapse in real time. Vanessa tried to run. She made it to the building's underground garage, into her Mercedes, before agents blocked the exit. When they pulled her from the car, she was screaming about harassment, illegal searches, violations of her rights. None of it mattered. The warrants were airtight. Carolyn Winters was arrested at her townhouse in Brooklyn. She'd been packing, preparing to flee to Europe. They found $50,000 in cash, 3 fake passports, and a laptop full of emails proving she'd helped fabricate Grace's suicide story. She broke within 2 hours of interrogation, trading testimony for a reduced sentence. By noon, every major news outlet was running the story. Real estate mogul arrested in murder for hire scheme. Manhattan developer accused of killing pregnant wife. Grace's photo, her real photo, not Emma Ashford's disguise, appeared next to Preston's mugshot. The media frenzy was instantaneous and brutal. Cable news ran constant coverage. Social media exploded with hashtags. Within hours, Grace went from ghost to sensation, her story dominating the news cycle. Marlo's article dropped at 3 p.m. Front page of the New York Times, The Woman Who Came Back from the Dead. It detailed everything: the accident, the affair, the murder attempt, Grace's months of planning, the evidence she'd gathered. The article went viral immediately, shared millions of times within the first hour. Grace watched it all from a safe house in New Jersey. Ruby asleep in her arms. Owen beside her monitoring news feeds. She should have felt triumphant. They were exposed, arrested, facing life in prison. She'd won, but all she felt was hollow. Is it always like this? She asked Owen. You destroy the people who hurt you, and then you just feel empty. Revenge isn't the same as justice, Owen said quietly. You got justice. That's more than most people get. Grace's phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Grace Hartford, a male voice, official. Yes. This is Agent Wilson, FBI. We need you to come in for a formal statement. There are complications with the case. Her stomach dropped. What kind of complications? Preston Hartford's attorney has filed a motion to suppress evidence, claiming illegal search and seizure. We need your testimony to be airtight. Can you come to Federal Plaza tomorrow at 9 a.m.? Grace agreed and hung up, anxiety coiling. They're fighting back. Owen checked his laptop. Douglas Reed is one of the best defense attorneys in the country. He'll attack every piece of evidence, every witness, every timeline. This isn't over yet. He was right. Over the next 3 days, Reed orchestrated a defense that was masterful and terrifying. He argued that Marcus Donovan's testimony was coerced, that the warrants were based on illegally obtained recordings, that Grace had faked her own death to frame Preston for insurance fraud. The media narrative began to shift. Did Grace Hartford stage her own death? Questions arise about alleged murder victims' testimony. Preston and Vanessa, out on $15 million bail, gave carefully staged interviews claiming they were victims of an elaborate con. "I loved my wife," Preston told CNN, eyes moist. "Her death destroyed me. To learn she's alive should be the happiest moment of my life. But instead, she's accused me of trying to murder her." It's insane. I think Grace had some kind of breakdown, and now she's created this fantasy to justify abandoning our life together. Vanessa played the wrong professional perfectly. "I was Preston's assistant, nothing more." The idea that we were having an affair, that we plotted to kill Grace, it's fiction. Grace was mentally unwell. Everyone around her saw it. This is a sick woman's revenge fantasy, and we're the victims. By day 5, public opinion was split. Half believed Grace, half thought she was a disturbed woman who'd faked her death and was now trying to destroy her ex-husband. The truth was drowning in spin. Then Caroline's testimony leaked. Someone inside the DA's office, probably paid by Reed, released Caroline's statement to the press. In it, Caroline admitted she'd helped sell the suicide narrative but claimed she'd been manipulated by Grace herself. "Grace asked me to say she was depressed." Caroline's statement read, "She said she wanted to disappear. Start over. I thought she was going to fake her death for the insurance money. I had no idea she'd turn around and accuse Preston and Vanessa of murder. I was used." Grace watched the press conference where Caroline's lawyer read the statement and felt the walls closing in. They were rewriting history again, turning her from victim to villain, and it was working. That night, Grace's legal team, provided by the DA's office, delivered bad news. The judge is skeptical. Reed's arguing is that without physical evidence of the actual push, without witnesses beyond Marcus Donovan, this case is circumstantial. We need more. Grace's voice rose. "I have recordings of them planning murders. I have financial crimes documented. I have all obtained while you were using a false identity and conducting corporate espionage." The lawyer interrupted gently. "Reed will argue entrapment, illegal surveillance, fraud. Grace, I'm not saying we can't win. I'm saying it's not the slam dunk we thought it was." Owen saw Grace's face crumble. "What are you saying they might walk?" "I'm saying we need to be prepared for the possibility that Preston and Vanessa could be acquitted of the murder charges. We might only get them on financial crimes, which carry much lighter sentences." After the lawyers left, Grace sat in the dark, holding Ruby, tears streaming down her face. "I survived," she whispered to her daughter. "I came back. I did everything right, and they might still win." Owen knelt beside her. "Then we find something else. Some piece of evidence they can't spin. Something irrefutable." "There's nothing." Vanessa was careful. "The only witness was me, and I'm not credible anymore." "What about the housekeeper, Jude? She was there the night you fell. Did she see anything?" Grace's head snapped up. "Jude, oh my God. Jude was working that night. She might have seen Owen. I need to find her. Now." But when they searched, Judith Moore had disappeared. Her apartment was empty, her phone disconnected. No forwarding at her address, no trace. She'd vanished the same day Preston and Vanessa were arrested. Either she was hiding, or someone had made sure she'd never testify. The trial date was set for 6 weeks out. Grace had 42 days to find the evidence that would destroy them, or watch them walk free. And somewhere in Manhattan, Preston and Vanessa were planning their next move. Judith Moore surfaced on day 37, 4 days before the trial. She called Grace's burner phone at 3 a.m., voice shaking. "They found me," Jude whispered. "Preston's people. They said if I testify, my daughter dies. Grace, I want to help you, but I can't. I have a family." Grace's heart sank. "Where are you, Mr. Motel 6, Route 9. I'm leaving the country tomorrow. Mexico, then further. But I needed to tell you that night. I saw more than I said. I kept something, insurance, but I can't use it. I'm too afraid. What did you keep?" a backup security drive. The main system was disabled, but there was a secondary camera Preston didn't know about. Old system from before the renovation. It caught everything. Grace, everything. Grace sat up, adrenaline spiking. Where is it? I mailed it. To you. Well, to Grace Hartford, the house in Hamptons. I didn't know where else to send it. I mailed it 3 days before your funeral and then ran. It should still be there unless someone found it. The Hamptons house, the beach property where Grace had lived with Preston, now sitting empty while tied up in estate proceedings. If the drive was there, if it had footage of Vanessa pushing her Jude, thank you, go. Get safe, I'll handle this. Grace hung up and turned to Owen. We need to get into the Hamptons house. Tonight. That's breaking and entering. If you're caught, I'm already dead. Remember what's one more crime? They drove through the night, arriving at the Hamptons estate at dawn. The property was dark, foreclosure notices on the door. Grace used her old key code. Preston had been too lazy to change it after her death. The alarm beeped. She entered the bypass codes. Still worked. Inside. The house was a mausoleum. Furniture covered in sheets. Pictures turned to walls. Everything frozen in time. Grace moved through rooms that had been her home, feeling like she was haunting her own life. The mail was piled near the door. Months of accumulation. Grace sorted through it with shaking hands. Bills, junk mail, notices, and then a padded envelope with Jude's handwriting, dated 8 months ago. Grace tore it open. Inside was a thumb drive labeled Backup, October 15th, the night she died. Owen pulled out his laptop. They sat on the covered sofa and plugged in the drive. The video file was grainy, time-stamped, from a camera positioned high on the cliff house exterior. It showed the pathway, the edge, the oceans beyond. At 11:43 p.m., Grace's wheelchair entered frame. Then Vanessa, exactly as Grace remembered. The audio was poor, but readable with headphones. Grace heard her own voice begging, heard Vanessa's cold responses. And then, clear as daylight, Vanessa's hands on the wheelchair. The push, the fall, Vanessa standing at the edge, watching. Then Vanessa pulling out her phone and calling Preston. The video ran another 3 minutes, showing Vanessa composing herself, fixing her hair, practicing her expression before heading back toward the house. That's it, Owen breathed. That's irrefutable proof. Grace was crying, watching herself die on camera. Send it to Marlowe. Send it to the FBI. Send it everywhere. Owen uploaded the file with shaking hands. Within an hour, the video was everywhere. News sites crashed under traffic. Social media exploded. The footage went viral faster than anything in recent memory. By noon, Preston and Vanessa were arrested again. Bail revoked. Douglas Reed held a press conference calling the video potentially doctored, but his voice lacked conviction. The timestamp matched cell tower records. The metadata was clean. The footage was real. The trial became a formality, with video evidence, Marcus's testimony, Caroline's cooperation, and financial records. The prosecution had an overwhelming case. Grace testified on day 3. She sat in the witness box and told her story to a packed courtroom. When they played the cliff footage, several jurors cried. Preston stared at his hands. Vanessa's face was stone. During cross-examination, Reed tried to discredit her. Mrs. Hartford, isn't it true you used a false identity to infiltrate your husband's company? Yes. You committed fraud, corporate espionage, illegal surveillance. Yes. So you're admitting you're a criminal. Grace met his eyes. I'm a woman who was murdered and came back to get justice. If that makes me a criminal, I'll wear the label proudly. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on all counts. Preston Hartford, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, money laundering, racketeering, sentenced 45 years without parole. Vanessa Caldwell, guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, sentenced life without parole. Caroline Winters, guilty of accessory after the fact, conspiracy, sentenced 12 years. Detective Morrison, guilty of corruption, obstruction, sentenced 20 years. When the judge read the verdicts, Vanessa finally cracked. She screamed at Grace across the courtroom. You should be dead. You were supposed to stay dead. Security dragged her out. Preston just sat there, broken, as they led him away in handcuffs. Outside the courthouse, Grace stood before a wall of cameras and reporters. Marlo was beside her, along with Owen and baby Ruby. "How does it feel to get justice?" a reporter shouted. Grace looked at Ruby, then at the cameras. "Justice doesn't fix what was broken. It doesn't give me back the 8 months I lost or erase the trauma. But it means my daughter will grow up knowing her mother fought back. That matters. What's next for you?" Grace smiled, genuinely for the first time in months. "Living, really, truly living. They tried to bury me. They didn't know I was a seed." 6 months after the trial, Grace Hartford sat in a therapist's office in Vermont, far from cameras and crowds and the constant reminder of who she'd been. Ruby played with blocks on the carpet, babbling to herself. Grace twisted a tissue in her hands, trying to find words for the therapist's question. "Do you feel like you've moved on?" Grace laughed, bitter and sharp. "Moved on, I have nightmares every night. I hear Vanessa's voice telling me I should be dead. I see Preston's face in every crowd. I can't trust anyone. I had a panic attack in the grocery store last week because a woman reached for a product on the shelf behind me too quickly." Does that sound like moving on? The therapist, Dr. Sarah Bennett, nodded without judgment. "Trauma doesn't have a timeline. You survived attempted murder, months of hiding, infiltrating your would-be killer's company, a trial. Your nervous system is doing exactly what it's designed to do, keeping you alert to threats. But there are no threats anymore. They're in prison. I'm safe, so why can't I feel safe? Because safety is a feeling, not a fact, and your body learned that the world is dangerous in ways most people never experience. That knowledge doesn't disappear just because the immediate danger is gone." Grace looked at Ruby, who was building a tower of blocks with intense concentration. "I don't want her to grow up with a mother who jumps at shadows." "Then we work on it, together. But Grace, you also need to acknowledge what you accomplished. You didn't just survive. You fought back. You exposed criminals. You protected your daughter. That takes extraordinary strength. It doesn't feel like strength. It feels like I'm barely holding together." Tom Bennett leaned forward. "Strength isn't the absence of pain. It's continuing despite the pain. You're here in therapy, doing the work. That's strength." The sessions helped. Slowly, Grace learned breathing techniques for the panic attacks. She processed the trauma in small, manageable pieces. She began sleeping more than 3 hours a night. The nightmares decreased from nightly to twice a week, but some things didn't heal. Trust remained almost impossible. Grace had exactly 3 people in her life: Owen, Marlo, and Dr. Bennett. Everyone else was held at arm's length. Dating seemed laughable. Friendship felt dangerous. Her world had contracted to the point where safety meant isolation. Owen noticed. He'd stayed close after the trial, helping with Ruby, providing stability. One evening, after Ruby was asleep, he found Grace on the porch, staring at the Vermont mountains. "You're disappearing again," he said gently. "Not physically this time. Emotionally, and I'm protecting myself. You're hiding. There's a difference." Grace turned to him, anger flashing. "You don't understand. They turned everyone I trusted against me. Caroline was my best friend for 10 years. 10 years. Owen. And she helped plan my murder. How am I supposed to trust anyone after that? You start small. You let people in gradually. You give them chances to prove themselves. And if they betray me, then you survive it, like you survived everything else." Grace, I'm not saying trust is easy. I'm saying isolation will kill you as surely as Vanessa tried to, just more slowly. His words haunted her, because he was right. Since the trial, Grace had been existing, not living. She moved through days mechanically, caring for Ruby, attending therapy, avoiding human connection. She'd won her fight for survival, but was losing her battle to actually live. The book deal came in month 7. A major publisher offered 7 figures for Grace's story. She'd turned down dozens of offers immediately after the trial, disgusted by people trying to profit from her trauma. But this one came through Marlo, who'd vouched for the editor. "They want to do it right," Marlo explained. "Not exploitation, a real account of domestic violence, survival, the justice system. something that might help other women. Grace hesitated. I don't want to relive it. Then don't write it alone. Hire a ghostwriter who specializes in trauma narratives. You tell the story once. They shape it. You approve everything. And the money could fund a foundation. Resources for women escaping abuse. The idea resonated. Money meant nothing to Grace anymore. Preston's assets had been seized and portions awarded to her in civil court. She had more than she needed, but using her story to help others, that felt like meaning. She agreed to the book deal with conditions: anonymity for Ruby, veto power over content, and all proceeds above her needs going to a foundation supporting domestic violence survivors. Writing the book was agony. Even dictating it to a ghostwriter meant reliving every moment. The accident, the isolation, the cliff, the months of recovery, the infiltration, the terror of almost losing Ruby. Some sessions, Grace couldn't continue. She'd break down, unable to speak past the tears. But slowly the book took shape, and in the process, Grace found something unexpected: catharsis. Putting it into words, organizing the chaos into narrative, helped her make sense of what she'd endured. The book, titled The Woman Who Refused to Stay Dead, published 14 months after the trial. It became an instant bestseller. Grace did limited press, a few carefully selected interviews with journalists she trusted. She spoke about survival, about the gaps in the justice system, about warning signs of abuse that she'd missed. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of women reached out, sharing their own stories. Grace's foundation received so many applications for assistance that they had to hire staff. The book became required reading in some domestic violence prevention programs. But success brought new complications. Grace was recognized everywhere now. Her face was famous. Privacy became impossible. Paparazzi followed her. True crime podcasts dissected her case. Internet sleuths debated every detail of her story. I went from being erased to being overexposed. She told Dr. Bennett, I just want to be normal. You'll never be normal again. Dr. Bennett said honestly, what happened to you changed you fundamentally, but you can find a new version of normal. One that incorporates both the trauma and the strength you've developed. Grace worked on finding that new normal. She moved to a small town in Oregon, bought a house with ocean views, and enrolled Ruby in a local preschool. She kept her name but lived quietly. No interviews, no press, just life. Owen visited monthly. Their relationship remained undefined, not quite romantic, not quite platonic, just two people who'd survived hell together and understood each other in ways no one else could. Do you ever regret it? Owen asked during one visit. Coming back fighting them. You could have stayed hidden, started fresh somewhere under a new name. Grace watched Ruby playing in the yard, fearless and joyful. Every day I regret what it cost me, the trauma, the loss of who I was before. But when I see Ruby, when I read letters from women who left abusive relationships because my story gave them courage, no, I don't regret fighting back. She paused, then added quietly, but I do wish I could feel whole again. Owen took her hand. Wholeness isn't about going back to who you were. It's about integrating who you've become. Grace squeezed his hand and hoped he was right. 2 years after Preston and Vanessa's conviction, Grace Hartford received a letter forwarded through her publisher. The return address was California State Correctional Facility for Women, Mayhem. Sender Vanessa Caldwell. Grace almost burned it unopened. Then curiosity won. The letter was 3 pages. Handwritten in Vanessa's elegant script: Grace, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to understand something. Not to excuse what I did, but to maybe give you closure. I grew up with nothing. Trailer park in Nevada. Addict mother. Absent father. I clawed my way out through intelligence and ruthlessness. By the time I met Preston, I'd convinced myself that success justified any method. That weak people deserved what happened to them. When I met you, I hated you immediately. Not because of who you were, but because of what you represented. Everything I'd fought for: money, status, security you'd been born into. You had Preston's love without trying. You had respect without earning it. And when the accident left you in a wheelchair, I saw opportunity. I told myself I was doing Preston a favor, freeing him from burden. But the truth, I was punishing you for having what I wanted, for being everything I could never be: authentic, loved, Enough. Pushing you off that cliff was the easiest thing I'd ever done. I felt nothing. No guilt, no fear, just satisfaction. I thought killing you would make me feel whole, but you came back. And watching you during the trial, seeing the strength you'd found, I realized something. You were never weak. You survived because you had something worth living for. I had nothing but ambition and hate. Prison has given me time to think, to see myself clearly. I destroyed lives yours, Preston's, my own because I was empty inside and thought violence could fill the void. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking you to let go of hate. Not for me, for yourself. Don't let what I did keep poisoning your life. You won. You survived. Don't give me the power to haunt you forever. I'll die in this prison. That's justice, but you get to live. Please, Grace. Actually live. Vanessa Grace read the letter 3 times, emotions warring, rage at Vanessa's attempt at redemption, sorrow for the brokenness that created a monster, and surprisingly, a strange kind of peace. She showed it to Dr. Bennett the next session. How does it make you feel, the therapist asked. Angry, and weirdly grateful. Grateful. She's right, I've been letting her haunt me, giving her power over my present because of what she did in my past. Maybe it's time to stop. Dr. Bennett smiled. What would that look like? Grace thought about it. It would look like dating without assuming betrayal, making friends without waiting for them to turn on me, letting Ruby have sleepovers without panicking, living like the danger is actually over. Those are big steps. I'm tired of small ones. Grace started with small acts of trust. She hired a part-time nanny, a college student named Emma who was kind and patient. Every time Grace left Ruby with Emma, panic clawed at her throat. But Ruby was always fine when she returned, smiling, safe, happy. She joined a book club in town. The women asked about her past once. She gave a brief version, and they never pushed for details. They just included her. Book discussions became coffee meetups. Coffee meetups became actual friendships. She went on a date, then another. The man, a local teacher named David, was gentle and funny. When Grace told him she wasn't ready for anything serious, he said, "That's okay, I like your company. We can figure out the rest as we go." It felt strange, being treated like a normal person instead of a victim or a symbol, but also good, like maybe she could be more than her trauma. Owen noticed the changes during his next visit. You look different, lighter. I'm practicing trust. It's terrifying. But you're doing it. That's what matters. Grace looked at him seriously. You saved my life twice, once on the beach, and again by staying when I pushed everyone away. Thank you. Owen's smile was warm. You saved yourself. Grace, I just provided the tools. Ruby, now 4 years old, ran up with a drawing. Mama, look, it's our family. The picture showed 3 stick figures, a big one labeled Mama, a small one labeled Ruby, and a medium one labeled Owen. Owen caught Grace's eye. Family, huh? Grace felt her chest tighten with something that wasn't panic. Hope, maybe. Yeah, I guess it is. The foundation Grace had established, Phoenix Rising, grew beyond her expectations. They provided legal aid, housing assistance, therapy, and job training for domestic violence survivors. Grace hired staff, most of them survivors themselves, and stepped back from day-to-day operations. The work was too important to be limited by her own capacity. She did speaking engagements occasionally, usually at domestic violence organizations or law enforcement training. Sharing her story still hurt, but it also connected her to something larger than herself. At one event, a young woman approached afterward. I left my husband last week after reading your book. He'd been escalating. I thought I could fix him. Your story made me realize I didn't have to die to be free. Grace hugged her. You did the hard part. Now let us help you with the rest. These moments made everything worthwhile. The trauma, the fear, the long road back to herself. If her survival helped even one person escape, it mattered. On the 3rd anniversary of the trial, Grace visited Preston in prison. She hadn't planned to, but something pulled her there, a need for closure she couldn't name. Preston looked old. Gray hair, deep lines, shoulders hunched. He sat across from her in the visitor's room and couldn't meet her eyes. Why did you come? He asked. I don't know, maybe to see if I still hate you. Do you? Grace considered. No, I pity you. You had everything and destroyed it for what? An affair. Money, pride, you threw away something real for things that don't matter. I know. His voice cracked. I think about you every day. What I did, what we had before I ruined it, Grace, I'm so, don't. Grace held up a hand. I didn't come for an apology. I came to tell you that I've forgiven myself. Preston looked confused. Forgiven yourself. For loving you. For missing the signs. For believing in you longer than I should have. I blamed myself for years. For not being enough to keep you faithful. For trusting Caroline. For all of it. But I'm done with that. What you did was your choice. Not my failure. She stood to leave. Preston reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her. I loved you. I know you don't believe that, but I did. Grace looked at him with clear eyes. No, Preston, you loved the idea of me, the trophy wife, the beautiful designer, the woman who made you look good. You never loved the real me. If you had, you couldn't have let Vanessa push me off that cliff. She walked out without looking back. In the parking lot, Owen was waiting with Ruby. How do you feel? Free, Grace said, and meant it. That evening, Grace stood on the porch of her Oregon home, watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson. Ruby was inside doing homework. Owen was cooking dinner, the smell of garlic and herbs drifting through the open door. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, the same ocean that had nearly claimed her life 3 years ago. But now, instead of fear, she felt only peace. The waves that had once dragged her under now whispered promises of renewal. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marlo. Documentary about your case just won an Emmy. Thought you should know. You changed the world. Grace. Grace smiled and pocketed the phone without responding. She didn't need awards or recognition. She had something better. Ruby appeared at her side, slipping a small hand into hers. Mama, Owen wants to know if you want pasta or chicken for dinner. Grace squeezed her daughter's hand, feeling the weight of all they'd survived and all they'd built. Let's ask him to surprise us. Ruby grinned and ran back inside, shouting their answer. Grace stayed on the porch a moment longer, watching the sun disappear below the horizon. Somewhere in California, Vanessa sat in a prison cell, and Preston mourned the life he'd destroyed. Somewhere in New York, women were reading her book and finding courage to leave dangerous situations. Somewhere across the country, laws were changing because she'd refused to stay silent. But here, in this moment, Grace Hartford was simply alive. Not a victim, not a symbol, not a ghost returning for revenge, just a woman who'd fallen and learned to fly. She touched the small scar on her wrist, a permanent reminder of the night she died. Then she turned and walked inside, toward the laughter and warmth of the family she'd built from ashes. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click. Grace Hartford had survived the fall, the betrayal, the fight, and the long road to healing. She'd transformed her pain into purpose, her trauma into triumph. And most importantly, she'd learned that surviving wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. So Grace Hartford fell from a cliff and rose like a phoenix. But here's the thing, her story only matters if it reaches the people who need it. If you know someone in a difficult relationship, someone who feels trapped or powerless, share this video. You might save a life. Hit that like button if you believe survivors deserve justice. Subscribe to join a community that refuses to let the truth stay buried. And drop a comment. I want to know, what would you have done in Grace's position? Your answer might help someone else find their courage.